Thank you all for being here this morning. I'm Deborah Kafori, your Multnomah County Chair. I'm going to make a few remarks and then we are going to hear from the report's author, Dr. Paul Lewis, and Kaya Sand, Executive Director of Street Roots. We're also joined on the Zoom call by our Chief Medical Examiner, Kimberly DeLeo, and Mark Jolin, who's the Director of the Joint Office of Homeless Services. We'll each say a few words and then we'll open it up for any questions. And I also want to thank our ASL interpreters, Sarah and Seven, for joining us today. Today, we're here to formally release Domicile Unknown, our annual report on people who died while experiencing homelessness. I can safely say for all of us who work on this report, there's not a single day in the year where we are not working to end people's homelessness permanently. But today is the day where we train our full attention to the devastating consequences of losing the fight to survive outside. And we grieve for the people we have lost. People who need the same basic needs as you or me. People who had friends and family who cared for them. People who were loved. And I'm sad to report to you today that 113 people doing their best to survive outside died on Multnomah County streets in 2019. 113 of our neighbors dying years before their time and in situations that were largely preventable. Today is about them. Their stories have been compiled so that they can be read, and it is not for us to look away. We started Domicile Unknown in 2011 when Street Roots first asked the county a simple question: how many people die on our streets each year? We didn't know. And we didn't know then just how much worse this housing crisis would get. We didn't know that another 643 people would die on these streets in the time since, a number that is most certainly and devastatingly an undercount. As a nation, America has faced housing crises before, during the Great Depression, after World War II, and in both instances, the federal government took actions that made it easier for people with low and moderate incomes to meet a basic human need, the need for shelter. We need a serious and comprehensive federal response now. We've needed one for years, and we know that it is possible. That our federal government won't spend the money needed to address a decades-long crisis occurring in every community across this country, but will continue to give tax breaks to people who don't really need them is shameful. But we're not giving up. Israel Baer, the former executive director of Street Roots, who first asked the question that set Domicile Unknown in motion, was right in his belief that this report can and has pushed us forward. And I want the families of those who died to know the difference that the lives and memories of their loved ones make. Last May, the voters of this community approved one of the largest per capita investments in homeless services in the country. This will fund critical wraparound services that will provide what families alone cannot: the expert help that will keep someone in their housing. I say that thinking of Tisha Moss and Michelle Wheeler, whose stories are in this report. Last Friday, the Portland Design Commission approved our county's plans to build the first behavioral health resource center in downtown Portland. This is the first center downtown meant expressly for people who experience chronic homelessness because of other chronic issues. This resource center will offer everything from lunch to shelter to transitional housing. And I bring up that project thinking of Terry Rhea, whose story is also in this report, and what a difference talking with peers who understood where he was and working on his behalf would have made for him. Today is the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. The COVID-19 pandemic has made the night even darker. So I urge all of us who are safely housed today to ask ourselves what difference we can make for the long night and the long winter ahead. We can give. You can give online on 211. We can become informed so that we can recognize that so much of what we blame individuals for is really the result of a merciless housing market and health insurance companies' systems rigged against people with no money. And we can honor those who have fallen victim to these forces by working together to end homelessness. In their names, I dedicate this work. And now I would like Dr. Paul Lewis to talk about the report itself. Dr. Lewis?
Gotta click the right button. So thank you, Chair Kafoury. You know, this year's report is really 11 years in the making, and I do remember the first meeting with Israel Bear and then Commissioner Kafoury to try to take this on, and we actually established a couple of principles that I think have actually served us fairly well in doing this. One is that we were going to kind of try to stick to our guns and pick at some definitions and not change them. We all know when definitions change, the numbers become pretty squirrely. We also wanted to make sure we were reporting on Multnomah County. We would like this to be in other counties, to be fair, but it's really just limited to Multnomah County. So we have to make sure that the individuals that we include were experiencing houselessness in Multnomah County. We also wanted to make sure that the report actually got done every year. You know, this report was delayed in release. It's actually been done for quite some time because of all the many other things going on. I actually think the winter solstice is a particularly poignant time to release it. We also, I was very strict about really only including those who were met the HUD or HHS definition of homelessness. I was very sensitive at the time to not want to have any question from reporters or trolls or anyone else that we were inflating the numbers. This is an absolute minimum estimate. I know the number is substantially higher, but if we were unable to confirm houseless status, we did not include them, and those statistics are included in the report. I think about 30% were not included. We just couldn't, we couldn't make that confirmation. And then the final principle, and again, Commissioner Kafoury at the time and Israel made a very, very, very compelling case to me that housing is health. And I think this report, unfortunately, for the 9th time in a row, illustrates that. So again, just to briefly run through the sections, I want to thank the Multnomah County Communications people for the beautiful formatting, and especially for the personal stories that are hard to read, but really must be read to understand where we point the finger, and it's not at these people who are really victims. 3/4 were male, 1/4 were female. The average age of death was mid-40s, and you don't need a statistician to tell you that that's a short lifespan. The range tended to be from late teenagehood to seniors, but an average age of 40 is extraordinarily low life expectancy. The race distribution broadly covers the local demographics. That is predominantly white, but there's numbers are small, but overrepresentation of both African Americans and Native Americans. It was particularly important a couple of years ago, but from the start, we borrowed a technique from our friends in Seattle to divide the year into a warmer phase and a cooler phase. And many years, the numbers are similar, but this year there was a pretty substantial difference, sort of 60-40, and the excess deaths were in the cooler months. It included at least 4 where hypothermia was the cause or contributing factor. Again, slightly repetitious, but about half the deaths were from what we call accidental causes. Those are mostly overdoses or really preventable trauma. Drugs and alcohol in general are the leading sort of contributor to the excess mortality, and often contribute not only among accidental deaths, but also among the so-called natural deaths, which include medical complications of drug and alcohol use. One thing, if you want to say what's different about this report, meth and amphetamines in general were the leading drug involved in deaths. and not just by a little. I think one year it was a tiny bit more, but this year it's really substantially more. The other interesting thing is that we've put a tremendous amount of effort and tremendous amount of attention on opiates, and actually alcohol exceeded opiates this year. So you rank ordered, it would be meth way at the top, then alcohol, and then quickly followed by opiates. And again, I think the names of the substances is less important than understanding that substance misuse is a disease. It's not a moral failing. The circumstances and antecedents in prenatal life and early life that lead to substance misuse are really longstanding, and there's very little room for individual blame. Another sad fact is that nearly 1 in 5 of the deaths were violent deaths by either suicide or homicide, frequently involving firearms. And then again, the deaths happen in a variety of locations. People are doing their best to stay warm, but most of them did occur outdoors or in a vehicle. Some folks did make it to a hospital. Houseless folks often do find little tiny bits of shelter. There were a couple of deaths in hotels and motels, and unfortunately, a trend that began a couple of years ago. A number of folks found drowned in the river. The mapping, again, similar to other years, it shows a concentration downtown and in inner southeast. But to me, the most important part of the map is that it covers almost the entire county, in that this is not a limited problem. There may be a concentration here and there, but there's many areas where folks are dying. And then finally, I've been extremely cautious about drawing conclusions about trends, but with nearly 10 years under our belt, I think the final graph illustrates, again, without a doubt, without need for a statistician, that there are clearly more deaths in the second half of the decade than there were in the first half of the decade. So I'll be happy to take questions later, but I do want to next introduce Kaya Sand. And Israel Bear has been a real inspiration to me with his life story and advocacy and teaching and explaining things to sort of thick-headed people like me. And when he departed Street Roots, I was really worried. But again, now that we've got Kaya, I'm just thrilled that she's stepped into that role. She's not the same as Israel, and Israel's not the same as her, but it doesn't matter. They're both really fantastic. And again, I love Street Roots, and I'm really thrilled that Kaya has moved into that role and stuck with that role. So next, we're going to hear from Kaya.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I'm actually addressing you from the Street Roots office. That's why I'm going to keep my mask on. And this is the space where we held the press conference last year. Behind me is a memorial that one of our Street Roots vendors, Rick Davis, has been building since last year. And he has described how he knows he will be forgotten unless he is memorialized. And I think it's really important for all of us to recognize just how important it is for folks on the streets to be honored and memorialized, and that part of how we memorialize people is through the actions that we take now for the living so that we can prevent more deaths. We've partnered since 2011 with Multnomah County, and we recognize that these deaths are preventable. That's the place we start from, that we need the knowledge to inform the work that we do. So this report is foundational for our advocacy efforts because it really is so clear what's at stake, that the difference between housing and homelessness is the difference between life and death. And it's not lost on me that we are releasing this report at the very same time that the Oregon legislature is discussing whether or not to extend the statewide eviction moratorium for another 6 months, because it expires at the end of the year. And it's predicted that tens of thousands of people would be evicted upon its expiration statewide. And I view eviction as, the fulcrum between housing and homelessness, and that it's not easy to reverse the process once it's in effect, because traumas pile up, mental health breaks down, family ties fray, and people sometimes self-medicate away the terror of it all and the terror of losing people, their friends, to these deaths. People undergo new violences. And so we know that there's a public health urgency of that frayed mental health, of that vulnerability to violence, of that self-medication through substance use disorders, because all of those are reflected in this report and in these early deaths. And so that means that we think about all of these steps that we take, the services that are going to be funded through the Metro tax measure, as life-saving, that we have to press forward to make sure that the promise of the statewide measure 110, which was passed this past November, that the promise is completed in terms of funding treatment for substance use disorder statewide. And we can view each housing unit in this frame, that it saves lives. Just to give one illustration, one of our Street Roots vendors moved into housing only a few weeks ago. And I see that as potentially a life saved, because she actually had already had both of her legs partially amputated from frostbite. And it was very frightening to think of her enduring another winter, because we witness that it's just too commonplace for people to actually lose bits of their body by amputation as they freeze, as they become infected. Homelessness really gnaws at the body and the spirit. So just in closing, every house built, every rent that's assisted, every eviction prevented, every mental health support and addiction treatment, all of it, every investment into the wholeness of the poorest people in our community. What this report reminds us is that all of that is about stakes that are life and death. Thank you. I appreciate so much all the work that Multnomah County puts into this. It's a very courageous and eyes wide open thing to do. And I'm going to pass it now to Chair Kafori so that we can turn to questions and answers.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, and thank you, Kaya, for your words this morning. I will open up for questions, and just to remind folks, we also have Mark Jolan, the Director of the Joint Office of Homeless Services, and Kimberly DeLeo, who is the Chief Medical Examiner. So Kate, will you help me field the questions?
Absolutely. And reporters, the standard Zoom invite has that silly message asking you to send me your questions, but please do unmute yourselves and ask your questions. If anybody has trouble, you can chat me, text me. But yeah, you should be able to unmute yourselves.
Dr. Lewis, Nigel Jake with Willamette Week. I'm wondering what in this year's report surprised you?
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. I appreciate that question. I think the meth trend, it didn't surprise me, but I just didn't think it could get much higher. So that's that. And again, so just in case folks don't know, the ecosystem that we've developed in this country and in this state has led to very pure, 90% pure meth being available for about the price of a latte. So it's just sort of, for some change, you could get really strung out and maybe kill yourself. So it's just a really profound thing. So I kind of just keep hitting myself. Is that really possible? Well, yeah, it is. And this report tends to be the bleeding edge, to be honest. We had fentanyl deaths in this group before in the other population. It's down this year. There seems to be less of that around. And then I think, Nigel, alcohol moving up. I and a number of others have been trying to maintain a broad spotlight on substance misuse, and the fact that alcohol is a little bit of a quieter killer in that it often leads to chronic problems as opposed to sudden death. And again, with alcohol moving up to number 2, I think sorry about that, phone's going off. That did surprise me. And then again, the amount of effort that the chair and Mark Jolin and TPI and volunteers have made for winter safety is really spectacular. So again, I think, as Kaya said, this is eyes wide open. I'm not happy that we're having excess winter's deaths, and including some from hypothermia. We're putting a spectacular, or not a spectacular, but a huge effort into preventing those. I'd like to think that it prevented some of those. So those are kind of my takeaways. And again, I do urge members of the media to read the personal stories. The numbers are just numbers, but every single one of these, and it's a lot, is an individual. Very few of us are not touched by the kind of struggles that some of these individuals have. And to try to address these medical and psychological and substance use struggles without a safe place to call home, I find just truly overwhelming.
Thank you.
I have a question. This seems like a pretty big jump. In last year it was 92, I think. And can you explain why you think so many more people died while experiencing homelessness this year?
Yeah, I think all of us should try to address that question. So I'll take a stab at it. The broad causes and manners of death are similar to other years. So again, just to speculate, if there's more folks who are homeless or houseless, we're going to have more deaths in that group. It's not like there's a special plague. I do worry about meth, as I mentioned before. It's a particularly pernicious drug and a very challenging substance to deal with both acutely and to try to get into recovery. So yeah, that would be my thoughts, but I'd love to hear Chair Kafoury and Kaya provide their insights.
Kaya, do you have some thoughts on this?
Well, I think just a couple things come to mind, and one is just that I think we have learned that we can correlate homelessness and death, and that so we're going to continue to see that rise. I also was struck by the high number of suicide in this year's count, and so I think that really underscores the needs we have to be really addressing mental health in all of our strategies. And so just what Chair Kafoury was talking about with even opening the county living room, that is the kind of strategy that we have to just do and build on in order to be addressing what is, again, a matter of life and death when we look at mental health.
And I would also just remind folks that one of the major causes of people experiencing homelessness is the inability to afford rent, and rents in our community continue to rise. Last year prior to COVID, I don't have any numbers on rents currently with COVID, but the rent keeps going up, and so the work that we do to place people in housing and give them the support services that they need gets harder and harder as it becomes more and more expensive to house folks, which is why I personally am so looking forward to the Metro homeless services money coming online so that we can give people the housing and the support services that they need to stay alive.
Hi, Rebecca Ellis here from OPB. Is it fair to say that the number 113 is almost certainly an undercount?
Yeah,
This is a Dr.
Rebecca,
Lewis
thank you for
question.
that question. You know, again, one of the, I don't know if you were on at the very start, one of the principles of we've established 10 years or 11 years ago, took a few years to get started, was that we would really make sure that there was no question about whether we were inflating the numbers. So this is an intentional undercount. We have to identify narrative or system documentation that the person was experiencing homeless in Multnomah County at the time they died. So again, it's hard to estimate that degree. The other source of error is that this report is based on things that come to the county medical examiner, and that's a subset of all deaths. Houseless folks often fall into that category, but not always. And the gap that we're aware of is that if someone had been, say, hospitalized for a month, that would just that death would be certified by the hospital staff and might likely would not come to the attention of the medical examiner. So we know we're missing that. It's been we've tried a number of times over the years to develop yet another system to capture those, and we haven't been successful with that. So it's clearly an undercount. Number one, lack of documentation of houseless status, and number two, deaths that occur after a hospitalization. We capture some of those, but not all of those. But again, as I like to say, you can take this number to the bank. It's not less than this.
I have another question if no one's going to jump in. Obviously, this year, in 2020, things are a lot worse and a lot different than they were last year. Do you have any advance idea how the numbers are looking for 2020?
You know, Lizzie, I feel terrible that I haven't done that work. It's you know, no excuses. Just it's been a really busy, challenging year, and the process I just described is actually quite time consuming to actually review each individual potential homeless death. And if it's not well documented, then trying to go to secondary and tertiary sources to try to find out if they were experiencing homelessness in Multnomah County. It's just a substantial effort, and I apologize I haven't been able to do it yet. We did a mid-year estimate, and again, crude, not what number I'm willing to share, because again, it doesn't meet our standards, but it wasn't less January through June.
I'll allow it because it has been a busy year. Don't worry about it. But if you were going to make any sort of no numbers, but looking at 2020, how do you think 2020 is going to compare to previous years in terms of these deaths, especially?
Well, you know, I want to make sure Mark can probably address this better than I transitioned my main work from the county back to clinical practice this year, and but before that transition, I did work with Mark and his team on really robust efforts to assure that those living in shelter would do so safely despite COVID. And nothing's perfect, but I think if we compare Multnomah County to some other jurisdictions in the country, I'm not aware of any substantial outbreaks of COVID among houseless. And even though we've diagnosed COVID among houseless, the system that Chair Kafoury and Mark have put into place assures that those people can be sheltered in a way that doesn't lead to outbreaks. So I think for that COVID aspect of 2020, I think Multnomah County so far, you know, fingers crossed, has done fairly well with that. For other causes, again, I'm not immediately aware of big changes, but I think there's what we call the denominator issue. If there are more people experiencing houselessness, it's possible that the number could change just because of that, even if the rate is the same, if the number is bigger. But if Mark's comfortable, perhaps he could address the COVID specific issues.
Mark, I think we need
Mark, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Thank you. I don't have a lot additional to say beyond what Dr. Lewis shared. We have understanding the risk that COVID presents for people experiencing homelessness in our community. Been doing everything in our power to ensure that folks outside are getting the gear they need to stay safe and PPE, and then redesigning our shelter system and ensuring that folks in congregate spaces have the necessary physical distancing capacity. And then have removed into motel shelters hundreds of people who are particularly high risk. So those strategies thus far have worked. We haven't seen significant outbreaks in the homeless population. We've definitely had positive cases. I don't have specific information around whether anyone experiencing homelessness has passed away from COVID in our community. But obviously we recognize that as a risk. And in terms of the other causal factors, I think to Dr. Lewis's point, what we do know is that over the last several years in our community, we've seen an increase in the number of people who are experiencing chronic homelessness. So people who are not just outside, but have been outside and homeless for a longer period of time. They have often very significant disabling conditions. Those can be physical disabilities, they can be behavioral health challenges, those kinds of conditions that make them more vulnerable. So, as we, as the chair said, move into the Metro measure and begin to be able to really increase our resources for that chronically homeless population, our goal there is to get more folks safer and certainly to not see these kinds of deaths on our streets and in our community in the years ahead.
So, Dr. Lewis, one last question at the risk of overstating the obvious. The point in time count last year, the big takeaway from that was the huge increase in chronic homelessness. I think it was 35%, 37%. Is that essentially why we see this big jump today, that if more people are chronically homeless, they're more likely to die?
So, getting on my thin ice here, and I always reserve the right to change my mind, but in general, we haven't done the kind of statistics, intentionally haven't done the kind of statistics that would allow that correlation, Nigel. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, I told you it's an underestimate, but I don't know how much of an underestimate. And the other is, I kind of got into this by participating in the counts of various kinds in the aughts, and having walked around, it's a not very good estimate. So doing that arithmetic of number of deaths divided by some estimate, they're both estimates, and that just, as a sort of a scientist, that just makes me very uncomfortable. Two estimates on top of each other doesn't necessarily make something good. So I've been very cautious about that. Regardless, I think the general mechanical principle is that if we have a rate of death among people experiencing chronic homelessness, and there's more people experiencing chronic homelessness, unless there's some magic in the world, there's going to be more deaths among that group, numerically. Does that answer your question? Kind of.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any other questions before we conclude?
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe. Happy holidays.